All right. Hello, everyone. So, it's been a month since I last uploaded my first video, and it was awesome to see that I had so many views. I honestly thought I would only get like 5 views after a month, and I didn't even realize until I saw a first subscriber. So, thank you for subscribing. Um, I am going to continue today now from chapter 2 of Outcasts United. Again, I apologize for my mispronunciation of names or places, pronouns, and I hope you will enjoy this. So let's see how far I will go today. I will try to read still. Oh, sorry, my hair is a mess. It's just gotten busier and busier. So let's see. I will start today with chapter 2 and hoping that I can continue until chapter 5. We will see. If I get tired or thirsty or I gotta go, then I gotta go. All right. So, chapter 2, Beatrice and her boys. In 1997, at about the same time Luma was graduating from Smith College in Massachusetts, a woman named Beatrice Ziadi was struggling with her husband and sons, Jeremiah, Mandela, Darlington, and Eric, to survive in the middle of a civil war in Monrovia, the capital of Liberia. Rival rebel factions had laid siege to the city, and soldiers roamed about, some decked in women's wigs and costumes, partly because of a superstitious belief that such costumes would fend off harm, and partly because of the sheer terror such surreal group get-ups induced in others. Bullets from the fighting cut down civilians with regularity, and mortars pierced the rooftops of family dwellings without warning. Then one night, the Ziadis were startled by a knock at the door. Beatrice's husband was a paymaster, a mid-level bureaucrat whose job entailed handing out wages to employees of the former government, and the men at the door wanted whatever cash he could access. Yelling, with machine guns, and in disguises, the men seemed like emissaries from hell. Beatrice couldn't make out what faction they belonged to, or if they were simply common thugs. You got all the government money. We got to get rid of you, one of the men said to Ziadi. Why, I'm only paymaster, he protested. I want to take care of the people. I only want to work to give the people a check. I got no government money. You have to give the government money. If not, we will kill you. I don't have, he pleaded. The Ziadi story, as well as any, shows the extent to which modern refugees can trace their displacement to the mistakes, greed, fears, crimes, and foibles of men who long preceded them, sometimes by decades or longer. Liberia had been founded in 1821 by a group of Americans as a colony for freed slaves who lived there first under white American rule and then in 1847 under their own authority as Africa's first self-governing republic. For the next 130 years, the Americo-Liberian minority, just 3% of the population, backed by the US government, ruled the nation of around 2.5 million as a kind of feudal oligarchy. Americo-Liberian rule came to a brutal end on April 12, 1980, when Samuel Doe, an army sergeant who had been trained by American Green Berets, stormed the presidential compound with soldiers, disemboweled President William Tolbert, and proclaimed himself Liberia's new leader. Doe was a member of the Kron tribe, a tiny ethnic group that composed just 4% of the population, far less than the larger tribes in Liberia, the Geo and Mano. With the Kron essentially replacing the Americo-Liberians as an American-backed oppressive ruling elite, it was only a matter of time before other ethnic groups felt aggrieved enough to revolt as well. The man who consolidated their rage was a former Doe associate named Charles Taylor, a librarian who had gone to college in Boston and New Hampshire and, after being convicted in an embezzling scheme, escaped an American jail through a window using a hacksaw and a rope of knotted bedsheets. Taylor began with a band of just 150 soldiers in a geo section of the country. Their motto, kill the Kron. His incitement to ethnic violence worked and his force grew, in no small part because of boys, some of them orphans whose parents had been killed by Doe, some of them kidnapped from their families by Taylor's own militias, that he armed and drugged into a killing frenzy. By 1990, he had laid siege to Monrovia. Water was cut off. There was no food or medicine. Soldiers terrorized citizens and looted at will. More than 100,000 Kron refugees flooded into Ivory Coast, even as those Kron soldiers committed atrocities of their own. Over 150,000 Liberians died. In 1996, Taylor made another attack on Monrovia and the Kron who lived there. Fighters on both sides engaged in cannibalism, ripping out hearts and eating them, wrote Martin Meredith in his book, The Fate of Africa. One group, known as the Butt Naked Brigade, fought naked in the belief that this would protect them against bullets. Even soldiers from ECOMOG, a regional peacekeeping force deployed to separate the warring factions, joined in the looting. Monrovia, Meredith wrote, was reduced to a wrecked city. Monrovia, of course, was where Beatrice Zaidi lived. Zaidi, sorry. She and her husband were Kron and remained in the sector of the city under Kron control. During the siege of 1996, they hid in their house as battles raged outside. When her youngest son, Jeremiah, fell sick, Beatrice could do nothing but pray. It was too dangerous to go outside for help. There was no food, no medicine, nothing, she said. I saw my child sick for 5 days. When that child doesn't die, then you tell God thank you. Eventually, though, even the Zaidi's home failed to provide refuge. The men who came in the night for Beatrice's husband began to beat him when he said he didn't have access to any stash of government money. Beatrice panicked. She grabbed Jeremiah and Mandela, her next oldest, and ran for the back door, which led out onto an alley full of shadows. The last words she heard her husband speak echo in her mind today as clearly as they were spoken that night. Oh, what do? He cried. They are killing me. Oh, they are killing me. With Jeremiah and Mandela, and by menacing teenage boys and young men burdened by the weight of guns and bandoliers, absurdly oversized for their small frames. The soldiers were content to let the Kron leave Monrovia. Beatrice and her sons made it out of town and began walking east, toward the border with Ivory Coast. She scavenged for food and hitched rides when she could, but mostly she lumbered through the bush until, after 10 days of travel, she arrived at an overflowing refugee camp across the border. She had left behind Darlington, who was staying with his parents in the Liberian countryside. Eventually, Darlington got word of his mother's whereabouts and made his own harrowing 2-day trek on foot to the camp to reunite with his mother and youngest brothers. Together, and with the help of other refugees, Beatrice and her sons built a mud hut for shelter. Then they waited, for what they weren't exactly sure. The end of the war, if it ever occurred, wouldn't be enough to lure them back to Monrovia. Beatrice's husband was gone. The city was in shambles. Taylor, whose forces laid waste to Monrovia, would come to power in an election in 1997, famously employing the campaign slogan, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I will vote for him." I'm sorry, let me say that again. He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I will vote for him. Winning largely because people feared he would restart a civil war if he lost. He used the power of his post to continue the killing until he eventually became the rare example of a Liberian leader who fell out of favor with Washington. He went into exile in Nigeria, was indicted for war crimes by the UN, and was eventually captured in an SUV stashed with cash and heroin on the Nigeria-Cameroon border. Beatrice passed the time in the camp by standing in lines to apply for resettlement by the United Nations, and actually undertook out of equal parts desperation and stubbornness. She knew the odds that she would be selected were minuscule, but what else was there to do? The camp, home to more than 20,000 refugees from the war in Liberia, was squalid, with frequent food shortages and a quiet threat in the form of soldiers who worked in the camp to recruit young men back into the war. In such conditions, education for her boys was next to impossible. Beatrice focused her energies on surviving, protecting her sons from recruitment and getting out. Beatrice and her sons spent 5 years in that camp. Against all odds and after countless interviews with UN personnel, Beatrice learned that she and the largest vote the largest city in Ivory Coast, to New York and then to Atlanta, Georgia, and their new home in Clarkston, a place never heard of. The Ziadis' resettlement followed a typical path. They were granted a $3,016 I'm sorry. They were granted a $3,016 loan by the U.S. Office of Refugee Resettlement for 4 one-way plane tickets to the United States. Beatrice repaid the money in 3 years. The family was assigned to an International Rescue Committee caseworker who would oversee their resettlement in the United States, past downtown Atlanta with its gaudy skyscrapers and gleaming gold dome Capitol building, to their new home, a 2-bedroom dwelling in Clarkston's Winecrest Apartments. The cupboards had been stocked with canned goods. The walls were dingy and bare. There were some old sofas to sit on and mattresses on the floor. The Ziadis stretched out on them and went to sleep. At the encouragement of the IRC, Beatrice Ziadi began her job search almost immediately. Like all refugees accepted into the United States for resettlement, she would only have 3 months of government assistance to help her get on her feet, to say nothing of the debt she owed on her plane tickets. With the IRC's help, she landed a job as a maid at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in the Buckhead section of Atlanta, one of the most exquisite hotels in the South, and in Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhood. It was an hour's commute by bus from Clarkston. Beatrice wasn't worried about the work. She was sturdy and self-sufficient. That's how she'd gotten to Atlanta after all. But she didn't like the idea of leaving her boys behind. They were going to school during the day, but she wouldn't get home from work until well after dark. She encouraged them to stay inside until she returned in the evening. Beatrice didn't know how to use the bus system in Atlanta, but a fellow librarian offered to show her the way from Winecrest to the bus stop on her first day of work. At 5:30 a.m., she set out for the Ritz. The work there was hard. Maids were expected to clean 15 to 16 rooms a day by themselves, and though the shifts were technically 8 hours long, in reality, it took much longer to clean so many rooms, extra work that occurred. Beatrice said, off the clock. Beatrice's back ached when she made it back to the bus stop at around 10 o'clock. Without her friend to guide her this time, she was on her own. As she rode the bus back through the strange glimmering landscape of Atlanta, she tried to put the fear of the last few years out of her mind. She allowed herself the uncharacteristically optimistic thought that maybe she and her family were finally safe. The bus heaved to a stop in Clarkston. Beatrice got off, hopeful she had chosen the right stop. She looked around and tried to recall the way back to her apartment. It was easy to get turned around in Clarkston. There were no tall buildings to help her orient herself, and it would take Beatrice the better part of a month to feel confident about the way back to Winecrest. She set out haltingly along the sidewalk. It was a cool October night filled with the sounds of chirping crickets and the intermittent whoosh of passing cars. Beatrice heard a noise and looked over her shoulder. A man was following her. She sped up and clutched her bag. It contained her new driver's license, social security card, work permit, and all the cash she possessed. She felt the man's hand on her arm. "Halt," he said. "Give me the purse." Beatrice let go of the bag and braced for a blow that never came. The man ran and she took off running herself in the opposite direction. Eventually she stopped, out of breath, and began to sob between gasps for air. She didn't know where she was or how to call the police. She was tired of running. A stranger, another man, found her and asked what had happened. He was friendly and called the police. The officers took Beatrice home and offered to help find the mugger. But she didn't get a good look at him. She only knew his accent was African. The incident robbed Beatrice of the hope that her new home would provide her and her family with a sense of security. She became obsessed with the boy's safety. In Liberia, a neighbor would always look after her kids if she needed to leave to run an errand or to visit a friend. But Beatrice didn't know anyone in Clarkston. Many of her new neighbors didn't speak English, and some of the ones who did frightened her. There was plenty of gang activity in and around Winecrest. Gunshots frequently pierced the quiet at night. For all Beatrice knew, the man who mugged her lived in the next building over. She didn't particularly trust the police either. She'd been told by librarians she'd met that the police would take your children away if you left them alone. So she told the boys and told them again, when you come home from school, go into the apartment, lock the door, and stay inside. One evening, not long after the mugging, Jeremiah disobeyed Beatrice. He was playing outside alone at dusk when a policeman on patrol stopped and asked him where his parents were. He had to think fast. She's inside sleeping, he told the cop. Well, then go inside, the officer said. Later that evening, Jeremiah told his mother what had happened. She went into a rage, fueled by the anxiety that had been building up for months. When you come home from school, go inside and you lock yourself in the house, Beatrice shouted at him. When you come home from school, you will lock yourself up. Sorry. All right. Chapter 3. Small Town, Big Heart. Before refugees like Beatrice started arriving, Mayor Swaney liked to say, Clarkson, Georgia was just a sleepy little town by the railroad tracks. Those tracks suture a grassy rise that bisects Clarkson and still carry a dozen or so freight trains a day, which rattle windows and stop traffic. Few, though, in Clarkson complain about the trains with much conviction. Amid the strip malls, office complexes, fast food joints, and sprawling parking lots of modern-day Atlanta, the sights of lumbering freight cars contributes to a comforting sense that Clarkson has not been entirely swallowed by the creeping sameness of urban sprawl. Indeed, while many small towns around Atlanta have been absorbed into the city or big county governments, Clarkson has retained its independence. Clarkson residents elect their own police department. A pastoral island of around 7,200, an excerpt of some 5 million people, Clarkson is still, improbably enough, a town. Clarkson was settled originally by yeoman farmers and railroad men in the years after the Civil War. They built the town's first Baptist church on land near a creek that was a popular site for baptisms, ground the church still occupies. Back then, Clarkson was sometimes called Goatsville, perhaps because goats were used to keep grass low by the tracks, perhaps as a pejorative by city folks. No one seems quite sure. But the name lives on, by allusion at least, in the mascot of Clarkson High School, the Angoras. For the better part of the next 100 years, little of consequence happened in Clarkson. It was a typical small southern town, conservative and white, and not too far removed in temperament from the next town over. Stone Mountain, a longtime headquarters of sorts for the Ku Klux Klan, and the site of cross burnings as recently as the late 1980s. Folks in Clarkson sent their kids to Clarkson High School, went to services at one of the churches on Church Street, and bought their groceries at a local independent grocery store called Thrift Town, which was located in the town shopping center across the tracks from the churches and the city hall. Life in Clarkson was simple, and few from the outside world paid the town much note, which suited the residents of Clarkson just fine. That began to change in the 1970s, when the Atlanta airport expanded to become the Southeast's first international hub, and eventually one of the world's busiest airports. The airport brought jobs, and the people working those new jobs needed places to live. A few enterprising developers bought up tracts of cheap land in Clarkson because of the town's location, just outside the Atlanta perimeter, a beltway that encircles the city and offers easy access to the airport and downtown. They built a series of apartment complexes, mostly two-story affairs with multiple buildings arranged around big commuter-friendly parking lots. Developers got a boost when MARTA, the Atlanta Public Transit System, built its easternmost rail station outside Clarkson. More complexes went up with idyllic-sounding names only real estate developers could concoct. Christopher Woods, Brannon Hill, Willow Branch, and Old Plantation. Middle-class whites moved in, and over time the population of Clarkson more than doubled. No one paid much attention at the time, but the addition of the apartment complexes had another effect, creating, in a sense, two Clarksons. Older Clarkson residents lived on one side of town in roughly 450 old houses, simple gabled structures with front porches and small front yards. Working-class newcomers lived in the apartment complexes. They were separate worlds, economically, socially, and otherwise. But since they were packed together on about 1 square mile, there wasn't much space in between them. In the 1980s, whites began to leave the apartments in Clarkson. The migration paralleled the white flight from other old residential residents close to downtown Atlanta. Crime was rising, and newer suburbs farther from town were roomier and more ethnically homogeneous. Middle-class whites in Clarkson, flush from Atlanta's economic boom following the opening of the airport, could afford to move. Vacancies rose and rents fell. Crime surged. Landlords filled the apartment complexes through government housing programs, which brought in African American tenants and simultaneously cut back on upkeep, allowing the complexes to fall into despair. Pretty soon, Clarkson, or at least the part of Clarkson consisting of apartment complexes, found itself caught in a familiar cycle of urban decay. In the late 1980s, another group of outsiders took note of Clarkson, the nonprofit agencies that resettled the tens of thousands of refugees accepted into the United States each year. The agencies, which include the International Rescue Committee, the organization founded in 1933 by Albert Einstein to help bring Jewish refugees from Europe to the United States, as well as World Relief, Lutheran Family Services, and others, are contracted by the government to help refugee families settle into their new lives. They help find the family's schools, jobs, and access to social services. But first, they have to find a place for them to live. From the perspective of the resettlement agencies, Clarkson, Georgia was a textbook example of a community ripe for refugee resettlement. It was not quite 13 miles from downtown Atlanta, a city with a growing economy and a bottomless feed for low-skilled workers to labor in construction, at distribution centers and packaging plants, and in the city's hotels and restaurants. Atlanta had public transportation in the form of bus and rail, which made getting to those jobs relatively easy even for those too poor to own cars. And Clarkson had its own rail stop at the end of the line. With all those decaying apartment complexes in town, Clarkson had a surplus of cheap housing. And though the town was cut through by two busy thoroughfares, Ponce de Leon Avenue and Indian Creek Drive, as well as a set of active railroad tracks, it had enough navigable sidewalks to qualify as pedestrian friendly, important for a large group of people who couldn't afford automobiles. The apartment complexes were within walking distance of the main shopping center, which was now drooping and tired, with a pawn shop across the parking lot from a daycare center. Their resettlement was smoothly any objection, if they even noticed these newcomers. After all, the apartments were still a world away from. So the agencies, encouraged by the success of that early round of resettlement, brought in other refugees, survivors of the conflicts in Bosnia and Kosovo, and oppressed minorities from the former Soviet Union. World Relief and the International Rescue Committee opened offices in Clarkson to better serve the newcomers and resettle still more refugees, now from war-raged African countries including Liberia, Congo, Burundi, Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. Between 1996 and 2001, more than 19,000 refugees were resettled in Georgia, and many of those ended up in or around Clarkson. The 2000 census revealed that fully one-third of Clarkson's population was foreign-born, though almost everyone suspected the number was higher because census estimates did not account for large numbers of refugees and immigrants living together in Clarkson's apartments. In a relatively short amount of time, Clarkson had completely changed. Nearly all of Clarkson's longtime residents had a story about the moment they noticed this change. For Emmanuel Ransom, an African American who had moved to Clarkson from Pennsylvania in the 1960s and who served on the city council, it was when he picked up on a sudden spike in the amount of garbage the town was producing each year. When he investigated, he found that the singles and nuclear families that had inhabited the town's apartment complexes were being displaced by families of refugees living 8 or 10 to an apartment and producing a proportionate amount of garbage, which the town had to haul away. The city didn't realize that we were being inundated with people coming in because it was a gradual thing, Ransom said. Nobody understood. For Karen Feltz, a chain-smoking anthropologist and city council member, it was when she noticed a Liberian woman in her neighborhood walking up and down the street with a jug on her head, cursing at the devil. After seeing the woman talking to herself on several occasions, Phelps began to fear she might be suffering a psychiatric breakdown. She approached the woman's husband, a minister, who shrugged off her concerns. He said, "She can talk to the devil if she wants to," Phelps recalled, with a laugh. I thought, "Oh my God, I'm living in the Twilight Zone." To many Clarkson residents, it felt as if their town had transformed overnight. You wake up one morning, said Rita Thomas, a longtime homeowner in Clarkson, and there it is. The change in Clarkson was an accelerated version of demographic changes taking place all across America because of immigration and refugee resettlement. But in at least one way, it was unique. While some towns, such as Lewiston, Maine, and Merced, California, have attracted large numbers of a single ethnic group or nationality, in Lewiston's case, Somalis, in Merced's case, Hmong, Hmong, and countless cities in the Southwest and West Latinos, Clarkson was seeing new residents who were from everywhere. If a group of people had come to the United States legally in the last 15 years, chances are they were represented in Clarkson in perfect proportion to the numbers in which they were accepted into the country at large. The town became a microcosm of the world itself, or at least of the parts plagued with society-shattering violence. And in the process, in less than a decade, Little Clarkson, Georgia became one of the most diverse communities in the country. Indeed, while the freight trains continued to rumble through town a dozen times a day, Little and Clarkson's looked familiar to the people who'd spent their lives there. Women walked down the street in hijabs and even in full burqas, or jalabib. The shopping center transformed. While Thrift Town, the grocery store, remained. Restaurants such as Hungry Harry's Pizza Joint were replaced by Vietnamese and Eritrean restaurants, a halal butcher, and a global pharmacy that catered to the refugee community by selling, among other things, international phone cards. A mosque opened up on Indian Creek Drive, just across the street from the elementary and high schools, and began to draw hundreds. Longtime Clarkson residents now know to avoid Indian Creek Drive on Friday afternoons because of the traffic jam caused by Friday prayers. As newcomers arrived, many older white residents simply left, and the demographic change was reflected in nearly all of Clarkson's institutions. Clarkson High School became home to students from more than 50 countries. Fully a third of the local elementary school skips lunch during Ramadan. Attendance at the Old Clarkson Baptist Church dwindled from around 700 to fewer than 100 as many white residents left town. While many of the changes in Clarkson were incremental and hard to notice at first, other events occurred that called attention to the changes and caused the locals to wonder what exactly was happening to their town. A group of Bosnian refugees who had come from the town of Bosanski Samak came face to face in Clarkson with a Serbian soldier named Nikola Vukovic, who they said had tortured them during the war, beating them bloody in the town police station for days. They eventually sued Vukovic, who was living just outside of Clarkson in the town of Stone Mountain and laboring at a compressor factory for $8 an hour, and won a $140 million judgment, but not before Vukovic fled the United States. A mentally disturbed Sudanese man who was left at home with his 5-year-old nephew went into a rage for reasons unknown and beheaded the boy with a butcher knife. He was found by a policeman walking by the railroad tracks in a daze, his clothing drenched in blood. "I've done something real bad," he told police, before leading them back to the apartment. Family members blamed the act on the post-traumatic stress the young man suffered after being tortured in a refugee camp, an explanation that hardly soothed the anxieties of older Clarkson residents, given the number of people in their town from just some such camps. A young member of the Lost Boys of Sudan, the 3,800 refugees who resettled in the United States after a 12-year flight through the desert and scrub of war-ravaged Sudan, died after getting bludgeoned by another Sudanese refugee in a fight over $10. An Ethiopian man was arrested and later convicted for conducting the brutal practice of female circumcision on his young daughter, and so on. Each of these events fed the perception that the refugees were bringing violent pasts with them to Clarkson, and might have organized or protested or somehow pushed back. But Clarkson wasn't a protesting kind of place. And the troubles of the 1980s had destabilized the community and imbued longtime residents with a sense of futility when it came to resisting change. Rather than making noise, during the first decade of resettlement, the older residents of Clarkson simply retreated into their homes. Okay, I'm going to pause for a little bit because my internet connection is not stable. Okay. The citizens of many communities might have organized or protested or somehow pushed back, but Clarkson wasn't a protesting kind of place. Oh, sorry, already read this. All right, I'm going to go back to. Okay. Karen Feltz remembers that when she moved to Clarkson from the nearby Atlanta neighborhood of Five Points, a community with a vibrant nightlife and where neighbors say hello and look after one another, she was struck by the strange wariness of her neighbors. Few people talked. A sense of community was missing. It took a while, but Feltz said she came to realize that the sudden changes brought on by resettlement has simply made people afraid. You're talking about 1.1 square miles of encapsulated Southern ideologies, Feltz said. For all the unique circumstances of formation, there was something altogether normal about the townsfolk's withdrawal from the public sphere. In 2007, a group of researchers led by the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam published a study detailing the results of surveys they had done with some 30,000 residents of 41 ethnically diverse communities in the United States. Their findings underscore they tend to avoid each other and to keep to themselves. Of diverse communities tend to withdraw from collective life, the authors wrote, to distrust their neighbors regardless of the color of their skin, to withdraw even from close friends, to expect the worst from their community and its leaders, to volunteer less, give less to charity, and work on community projects less often, to register to vote less, to agitate for social reform more, but have less faith that they can actually make a difference, and to huddle unhappily in front of their television. In Clarkson, the withdrawal from collective life was matched by the growing resentment at the forces, and people that had caused it kept their anger to themselves. But as resentment built, it would begin to find its expression. Nobody knew what to do about it, so they just sort of ignored it. Karen Feltz said of the influx of refugees, and that's how we got in trouble. The first signs of trouble surfaced in interactions between the refugees and the Clarkson Police Department in the late 1990s. The police chief at the time was a man named Charlie, or Charlie to people in Clarkson, Nelson, an old school presence whose office wall was adorned with a poster of Barney Fife, the goofball deputy on the Andy Griffith Show, captioned with the phrase, "Hell no, this ain't Mayberry." The refugees were a constant problem in Nelson's eyes. They didn't understand English. Many were poor drivers. Some, when pulled over, gesticulated and cried out, and even reached out to touch his officers, a sign of disrespect, if not outright aggression, to most American police officers. Nelson looked askance at diversity training and opposed offering any special treatment for refugees, particularly in the area of traffic violations. Writing traffic tickets to refugees became one of Clarkson's more reliable sources of revenue. A study by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution found that the average Georgia town of Clarkson's size raised about 9% of its budget from traffic tickets. In Clarkson, by contrast, the number was 30%. Nelson argued that he was simply enforcing the law. It wasn't his fault, he said, if some refugees hadn't learned the rules of the road in the United States. But the refugees felt singled out. A lot of our community members felt harassed, discriminated against, said Salahuddin Wazir, the imam of the Clarkson Mosque, whose congregation was often ticketed for parking improperly around the mosque at Friday prayers. They were all just pulled over for anything. Eventually, some members of the refugee community became so fed up with what they saw as harassment from Nelson's force that they decided to act. For many, doing so meant taking a leap of faith. Most had come from war-ravaged regions where the police and other authority figures were not only untrustworthy, but frequently active agents of oppression. To stand up to the police in America was to take the nation's promise of justice for all at face value. In one incident, a Somali cab driver, after getting pulled over by a Clarkson police officer for reasons he thought bogus, summoned other cabbies from the Somali community on his CB radio. His colleagues quickly drove to the site of the police stop. The officer feared a riot might occur and let the driver off with a warning. In 2001, Lee Swaney, a longtime city council member and a self-described champion of Old Clarkston, that is, Clarkson before the refugees, ran for mayor. As an advocate of life as it was in a simple southern town, Swaney fit the part. The owner of a heating and air conditioning business, he had a big walrusy mustache and sleepy eyes that made him look older than his 68 years. He drove a big white pickup truck of the sort you might expect to see on a ranch, wore cowboy boots and American flag lapel pin, and spoke with a thick, low country accent that betrayed his South Carolina upbringing. Swaney's platform reflected his old school values. He promised the citizens of Clarkson that if elected, he'd work hard to loot a good old-fashioned American hamburger joint to open up within the city limits. A year and a half after Swaney took office, something happened that pushed the tensions of Clarkson over the edge. Refugee agency officials announced that they plan to relocate some 700 Somali Bantu to Georgia, many of them to Clarkston. The Somali Bantu presented an extraordinary challenge for resettlement officials. An assemblage of agricultural tribes from the area of East Africa, now comprising Tanzania, Malawi, and Mozambique, the Somali Bantu had undergone more than 300 years of almost uninterrupted persecution. They were kidnapped and sold into slavery with impunity in the 18th and 19th centuries by Arab slave traders. Later, under the Sultanate of Zanzibar and subsequent rule by the Italian colonial government, the Somali Bantu were enslaved to work on plantations, a condition that persisted until as recently as the 1930s. When the British granted Somalia its independence in 1960, the Bantu were hounded, abused, and brutalized by ethnic Somalis. When the Somali Civil War began in 1991, the persecution accelerated dramatically as warring factions forced the Somali Bantu off their land in the fertile Juba River Valley. Amid the lawlessness and the systematic campaign of rape, torture, and killing, the Somali Bantu fled en masse with other persecuted Somalis to the empty and dangerous open spaces of northeast Kenya and into 4 main refugee camps established there by the United Nations. By the late 1990s, the population of those camps exceeded 150,000. This history of persecution and wandering had torn at the social fabric of the Somali Bantu and left them, on the whole, poor, deeply traumatized, and far removed from the trappings of the modern world. They had little in the way of education. Many lived their lives in primitive conditions with no running water or electricity. Their cultural isolation was acute as well. The Somali Bantu were sometimes referred to by Somalis as the Uji, from the Italian word oggi, meaning today, for their perceived inability to think beyond the moment, a misunderstanding rooted in the different way that agrarian Somali Bantu conceived of time. Somali Bantu slated for resettlement in the United States, it was clear, would need a great deal of help. They would need to learn English and how to fill out job applications, and they would have to acclimate themselves to the mores and expectations of the American workplace. They would have to accomplish their assimilation while somehow coping with the psychological aftermath of extreme trauma. Many Somali Bantu women had been raped, and not a few of the refugees had seen family members and fellow villagers slaughtered before their eyes. One Somali Bantu I met told me with good humor about his initial puzzlement over window blinds. Having never seen them in his time living in a windowless dwelling in Somalia or his makeshift shelter at a Kenyan refugee camp, he had no idea how they worked or what they did. Few in Clarkston knew anything about the history of Somali Bantu when they learned through media reports that another wave of refugees was coming to their town. But some, like Karen Feltz, the anthropologist councilwoman, began to do some research. What she found alarmed her. She understood that the Bantu would need a great deal of help, but she was unclear about who exactly was going to provide it. The resettlement agencies were underfunded and overwhelmed as it was. Feltz wondered if the agencies were even aware of the magnitude of the challenge that awaited them. She began to ask questions. Feltz wanted first to know where exactly in Clarkston the agency planned to house the newly arrived Bantu refugees. The agency said they planned to scatter the Bantu around the various apartment complexes in town, wherever they could find vacancies. The Bantu, Feltz learned, would be living in the same complexes as many of the ethnic groups that historically had persecuted them. When Feltz heard this, she had a fit. These people are afraid of the police to begin with, Feltz said. If something happened, they would never come forward and say anything. Who are they going to tell? They think everybody's out to get them. The people they're living with, who raped their women, stole their children, and murdered their men, do you think they're going to say anything? These people would be living lives of terror. To Feltz and many others in Clarkston, the housing plan encapsulated everything that was wrong with the way refugee resettlement was being handled in their town. The federal government didn't provide the agencies with enough money to do the job required of them, and the agencies, in addition to lacking a basic understanding of the plights of the people they're resettling, weren't willing to admit that they were too overwhelmed to do the job. So the refugees kept coming. Ultimately, Feltz believed, two groups of people would pay the price for this collective failure: the refugees themselves and the residents of Clarkston, a small town with few resources and no expertise in handling the cultural assimilation of a group of traumatized and impoverished East African farmers into the American South. Anger over the Bantu resettlement plan prompted Mayor Swaney to act. He reached out to the heads of the agencies to see if they might be willing to answer questions from locals at a town hall meeting. The provost of Georgia Perimeter College, a community college just outside the city limits of Clarkston, agreed to provide an auditorium and to act as a moderator. And representatives from the agencies, sensing a rare opportunity to speak directly to the locals, agreed to make themselves available as well. The day before the meeting, Mayor Swaney struck a hopeful tone in an interview with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Maybe we can find a way for everybody to work together, live together, and play together, he said. On the evening of March 31st, 2003, about 120 Clarkston residents filed into an auditorium at Georgia Perimeter College and began to fill out index cards with questions. Agency representatives and immigration experts took their seats behind a table on stage. The provost stood to begin the question and answer section. He looked down at the index cards submitted from the audience. The first question was, what can we do to keep refugees from coming to Clarkston? The tone of the meeting scarcely improved. Residents finally gave voice to years of frustration over the resettlement process. The agency officials, taken aback by the show of hostility, became defensive. When one resident asked why the town had not been consulted in advance about the relocation of the Somali Bantu, an aid agency representative calmly reminded the crowd that this was America, and the law didn't require people to ask City Hall for permission before they rented an apartment. In truth, the agencies might have been even harsher had they not had the politics of the moment in mind. Most strongly felt that without resettlement, Clarkston would have been much worse off. The agencies bargained with the landlords of those big apartment complexes, demanding that they clean up and maintain their buildings and that they cut refugee families slack on deposits and first month's rent in exchange for a steady flow of new tenants. There were already gangs, addicts, and a rougher element living in those apartments when the agencies began sending refugees to the landlords. Without the refugees and the upkeep on which the agencies insisted, most in the resettlement community felt Clarkson might have deteriorated into a slum. Eventually, the patience of the resettlement officials and refugee advocates at the meeting wore down. Some refugee advocates in the crowd began to attack the residents as callous and even as racist. "Aren't you happy you saved a life?" one refugee supporter growled at Rita Thomas, a longtime resident and civic booster of Clarkson who had spoken out against the resettlement process. "I certainly am," Thomas snapped, "but I would have liked for it to have been my choice." At the end of the evening, most in attendance felt that rather than soothing the hostility over resettlement, the meeting had congealed it. Jasmine Majid, a Georgia state official who coordinated refugee resettlement and who had been on stage, told an Atlanta newspaper afterward that some of the questions asked at the forum reflect a very sad and negative aspect of Clarkston. Locals left the meeting just as discouraged. "It was terrible," Karen Felt said. "We were really trying to sort things out and make things better, but it didn't turn out that way." Chapter 4. Alone Down South. Luma Mufle. Oh no, I'm sorry. I actually looked up some videos of Luma, and I did learn how she or others will pronounce her last name, but I've completely forgotten. So I am very sorry once again. Luma Mufle knew nothing of Clarkston or the refugees there when she moved to the nearby town of Decatur, only a few miles west of Clarkston down Ponce de Leon Avenue. Decatur was coming into its own as a liberal enclave in mostly conservative Atlanta. There was a groovy cafe, the Java Monkey, a bar specializing in European beer called the Brickstone Pub, and an old-school bohemian music venue called Eddie's Attic. Luma found a job waiting tables. She made a few friends and, as if by reflex, began looking around for opportunities to coach soccer. As it happened, the Decatur DeKalb YMCA, just down the road from the old courthouse and the home of one of the oldest youth soccer programs in the state, was looking for a coach for their 14 and under girls team. Luma applied and got the job. Luma coached the only way she knew how, by following the example set for her by Coach Brown. She was more demanding than any of the girls or their parents expected. She made her players run for 35 minutes and do sets of sit-ups, push-ups, and leg lifts before each practice, and she refused to coddle them. Luma explained to her girls that they would be responsible for their actions and for meeting their obligations to the team. Players who couldn't make practice were expected to call Luma themselves. There would be no passing off the excuse-making to mom or dad. Likewise, if a player had problems with the way Luma ran the team, complaints about playing time, favoritism, or the like, she would be expected to raise those concerns directly with the coach. Luma's approach did not sit well with all of her players' parents. Some were mystified as to why their daughters had to run themselves to exhaustion, while others couldn't understand why Luma punished the girls with extra laps or time on the bench when their parents dropped them off late for practice. Luma's rulemaking wasn't entirely about establishing her authority over the team, though that was part of it. She also believed that the team would benefit once individual players started to take responsibility for themselves. Luma herself had been coddled by her parents in an atmosphere of privilege and entitlement, and believed that she had paid for these comforts by sacrificing her self-reliance and independence. If Luma was going to coach, she was going to do so with this basic lesson as a backdrop, whether her players' parents understood it right away or not. Time would tell whether her approach produced results. Parents would get upset about certain things she did, said Kim Miller, a researcher at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, whose daughter Maritza played on Luma's team for 3 years. They'd say, "Oh, can you believe she made them run barefoot?" Or, "Oh, can you believe she made them run laps because we were stuck in traffic?" Luma was really tough. They had to take responsibility for what they did. If you were angry with the coach, it wasn't "go home and tell your mom." She didn't want to hear from the mommies. She wanted the girls to be responsible. When confronted by unhappy parents, Luma displayed a confidence incongruous with her status as a newcomer, an attitude that put off some parents and intrigued others. Once, when Luma ordered her players to practice barefoot to get a better feel for the soccer ball, a team mother objected on the grounds that her daughter might injure her toes. "This is how I run my practice," Luma told her. If she's not going to do it, she's not going to play." During Luma's first season as coach, her team lost every game. But over time, her methods began to pay off. Dedicated players returned, and those who didn't buy in left. The players worked hard and improved. They stopped questioning Luma's methods and began to absorb and intuit them. In her third season, Luma's 12 and under girls team went undefeated and won their year-end tournament. The players and parents who went through that experience speak about it now in near mystical terms. "I don't usually use this word," said Kim Miller, Maritza's mother, "but it was magical. She helped cultivate them and truly gave them more skills than soccer. She helped them thrive." Now 15 and an active soccer player, Maritza Miller describes her time on Luma's team as life-changing. "She realized from the start that it's not something just on the field," Maritza said. "It's about trust. None of my other coaches thought that way." Luma made the team the focus of her energies in those early days in Georgia. But however fulfilling, coaching soccer couldn't distract Luma from frequent bouts of homesickness for her friends and family. She still wasn't speaking to her parents, who would hang up the phone on her if she ever called home, and she missed her younger sister Inam, who was now a teenager and no longer the little girl Luma remembered. Then in 2002, Luma's grandmother, Munawar, her lifeline to her family, died in Jordan. When Luma was grieving, her preferred therapy was to get into her daffodil yellow Volkswagen Beetle, put on some music, something fast and peppy, and simply drive. She didn't particularly know her way around Atlanta, but the unfamiliar surroundings, the strange mixture of gleaming glass office buildings, columned houses, stucco McMansions, and long desolate stretches of worn-out row houses distracted her with a sense of discovery. In Atlanta, one could traverse gaping boundaries of race and class by simply crossing a street. On one of those trips, Luma found herself lost in what seemed to be a rundown area beyond the eastern side of the perimeter, only a few miles east of Decatur. What she saw confused her. Amid the decrepit apartment complexes, the soulless strip malls, the gas stations, and the used car dealerships, there were women walking the streets in chadors and hijabs, and others in colorful African robes and headdresses. Luma came upon a small grocery store with a sign indicating that it was a Middle Eastern market called Talars. She pulled into the parking lot, went in, and took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the old familiar smells of cardamom, turmeric, and cumin. Luma could hardly believe it. She stocked up on groceries, pita bread, hummus, and halloumi, a salty sheep and goat's milk cheese that was one of Luma's favorites. Then went home to make herself a meal like her grandmother might have made. Luma became a regular customer at Talars, and each time she visited, she again confronted the strange sight of African and Middle Eastern dress on the streets. She had discovered Clarkston the way most Atlantans did, by accident, and like most of the people who drove through Clarkston, Luma was too preoccupied with her own worries to give much thought to the unusual tableau around her. Luma also had to make a living, and waiting tables wasn't bringing in the sort of income she needed to survive in Atlanta. Neither did it suit her nature. Luma was better at giving instructions than taking them. She looked into the possibility of opening a franchise of an ice cream parlor chain, and when that didn't pan out, decided to start her own business, a cafe that sold ice cream and sandwiches, a place where people could spend the day and relax without being hassled. She found an available storefront in downtown Decatur midway between her apartment and the YMCA, and cobbled together a group of investors from the friends and contacts she'd made around Atlanta, including some of the parents of her players at the Y. In 2003, Luma opened her own cafe, Ashton's, named after a friend's dog, in an out-of-the-way building in Decatur alongside the still busy Atlanta to Athens railroad line. Running Ashton's was tough. Luma found herself putting in 16-hour days, preparing food early in the morning and cleaning up late after the close. It was lonely work, but Luma had taken on the challenge of succeeding, for herself and for her investors. She still wasn't speaking with her parents in Jordan, and her desire to prove her independence to her family back home drove her to work even harder. But the plan wasn't working out. Ashton's was too far off the beaten path in Decatur to lure enough customers to make money, and Luma found herself working longer and longer hours to keep the place afloat. She was still coaching her girls' team in the evenings, and she was exhausted. One afternoon, Luma decided to drive to Talars to pick up some of her favorite foods from back home. Distracted by her anxiety over losses at Ashton's, she inadvertently drove past the store and had to make a U-turn in the parking lot of a dreary old apartment complex called the Lakes. While turning around, she came across a group of boys playing soccer on the asphalt. From behind her windshield, she could see the boys playing the game with the sweaty mixture of passion, joy, and camaraderie she recognized from the games played in the empty lot on the other side of the fence from her grandmother's house in Amman. But unlike in Amman, the boys playing in Clarkston seemed to come from a confusion of backgrounds. They were white, black, and brown. Luma parked her car and watched. I stayed there for over an hour, she recalled. They were barefoot, but they were having such a good time. The sight of the boys of so many ethnicities in one place began to open Luma's eyes to what was happening in Clarkston, own home. She asked friends about Clarkston, including a woman she'd met in Decatur who worked with refugees at one of the resettlement agencies. Luma began to learn the particulars of the difficulties refugees face upon arriving in the United States. At the time, thousands of refugees had already been resettled in and around Clarkston, and more were coming every month. I'd never questioned why they had a Middle Eastern grocery store in Clarkston. I knew there were refugees, but I had no clue about the numbers. On another trip to the grocery store in Clarkston and retrieved a soccer ball, then got out of her car, approached the boys, and asked if she could join in. The boys were wary. She was a stranger, a grown-up and a woman to boot. There were all manners of crazies in the apartment complexes in Clarkston. Maybe she was one of those. But Luma also had a new ball, and the one the boys were playing with was scuffed and ragged. They reluctantly allowed her to join in. Once the game started, the boys saw that Luma could play. She set them up with quick passes and broke up attacks on her team's goal. Soon, Luma was running herself sweaty, pleasantly lost in a game with strangers. It was a rare moment of connection in a world that for Luma still seemed impenetrable and socially separate. It reminded me of what I miss about my community at home, she said. And at the time, I felt like such an outsider. Over the next few weeks and months, Luma continued to stop in at the lakes on her trips to Talars. She was getting to know the boys, learning bits about their pasts and their family struggles. Some had just arrived and spoke little English. Her Arabic and functional French helped her communicate with kids from the Middle East and Sudan, as well as the Congo and Burundi. They began to open up gradually about their lives. Luma learned that the boys lived in all kinds of impoverished family arrangements, often not with parents, but with uncles, aunts, and cousins. In snatches of conversation, she got a glimpse of the boys' isolation from the new world around them and their desire to connect. The loneliness that resulted from being uprooted was something that Luma intuitively understood. Luma also learned that picking up soccer on the town's parking lots was the only kind of soccer the refugee kids could afford. Even the modest fees required to play soccer at the local public schools were prohibitively high for most of the boys' families. Luma couldn't help but notice how much more passionate these boys were for the game compared to the girls she coached at the YMCA. They played whenever they could, as opposed to when they had to, and they didn't need the trappings of a soccer complex or the structure of a formal practice to get inspired. Luma decided that the kids really needed a free soccer program of their own. She didn't have the foggiest ideas of how to start or run such a program. She certainly couldn't afford it. And with a restaurant to run and a team of her own to coach, she hardly had time to spare. But the more she played soccer in the parking lots around Clarkson, and the more she learned about the kids there, the more she felt a nagging urge to engage and to do something. Eventually, Luma floated the idea of starting a small, low-key soccer program for the refugees to the mother of one of her players, who was on the board at the YMCA. To her surprise, the Y offered to commit enough money to rent the field at the community center in Clarkson and to buy equipment. Luma figured she could devote a few hours a week to a soccer program and still keep Ashton's running. She decided to give it a try. With the help of some friends, Luma crafted a flyer announcing soccer tryouts at the Clarkson Community Center in English, Vietnamese, Arabic, and French. She made copies and on a warm early summer day drove around Clarkson in her Volkswagen and posted the flyers in the apartment complexes. She wasn't sure that anyone would show up. Okay, so I will pause this now for today, and I am really sorry, but I don't know when the next time I'll read this will be. The next chapter is chapter 5, The Fugees Are Born, which I am personally very excited with. I think just like the last time that I was reading this, right, learning the story about Luma, and especially with the social climate that we are in now, it's more relevant than ever, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, if anything, is a really good wake-up call for all of us, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of who we are, what we believe in, what we don't believe in. It doesn't matter. What you do need to understand and believe is that every single human life matters, and violence needs to stop in whatever form. Physical violence, mental abuse, all of these violences need to stop. The world is a crazy, crazy place, and it's probably going to get crazier. But you know what? There is always hope, right? There has to be hope. There has to be hope and light at the end of the tunnel, because if there is no hope, then the world is way too depressing to live in. Yeah, again, I really don't know when the next time I read this will be. I really hope it will be soon, because I want to know how this continues and I want to learn about this. And for me personally, I think it's just always a learning experience, right? I love watching sports, even though I am not an athlete at all. I have really poor hand-eye coordination, and I could not play any kind of sport really competitively, right? But at the same time, I love watching sports like basketball, soccer, or football. I love watching Olympic sports, and I have so much respect and admiration for Olympians, right? Because there is so much discipline and so much work that goes in. And, you can say, of course, that people like NBA athletes or UEFA champions are so overpaid. But you can also say that our essential workers, our doctors, our teachers, our nurses, our frontline workers, our service industry workers, retail workers are also underpaid and overpaid a lot. I think you can argue that very easily either way, because, for example, right now, right, our healthcare workers are literally risking our lives more than ever to try to help our society. And Our small businesses are suffering because of the pandemic. And our people who care are working harder than ever. But we need to care. We need to continue to care. So whatever happens, in the next second, in the next moment, in the next day, will happen, right? But every day is a new day. And I really hope that, just continue to have hope in whoever you believe in or don't believe in. Because without hope, then we have nothing, right? But we need to have hope, and we need to have love, and we need to be strong, because we're all in this together, whether or not we like to believe it, right? So it's time to stop being selfish. It's time to start caring for other people. It's time to work harder, but also find time to relax. And actually, reading this book has been very relaxing for me, while learning so much. Right? And I hope that it does the same for you. I do apologize again if my accent is different or I speak too fast or too slow. I think that is the power of YouTube, that you can always turn on the speed for a faster speed or a slower speed. So I hope that you enjoy this. And, until next time.